This presentation was recorded at the 2015 ANZICS ACCCN Annual Scientific Meeting.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker onto the stage, who is Rod Oram. He's a highly respected international business journalist. He's written previously for the Financial Times of London and now lives in New Zealand and is widely known in the media in New Zealand. He has amazing insight into the global and local economy, and he's going to share some of that insight and tell us how we might apply those insights to the healthcare system. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Rod Oram.
Kia ora tātou, good morning, and it's a huge pleasure to be with you today. As a journalist, a business journalist, I range very far and wide across the economy, and so I'm very much a generalist as opposed to deep specialists as you are. But I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about what's going on in the health sector. The older I get, the more I care about it. And it seems to me there's an awful lot going on in terms of the economic and social pressures on healthcare. And we know how intense those pressures are. You live with those every day in the constrained resources that you have. So what I'd love to offer you today is a sense of what's going on in the world and how we might not just manage those pressures here in Australia and New Zealand, but how we might make some sense of that for all the people in the world. There's only 7.3 billion of us now. We're heading probably for about 10 billion, so there's quite a lot of work to do. And it's about how this happens one by one. And it goes something like this. I'm going to rely on, as my guide in this, one of my favourite poets here in New Zealand, Alan Curnow, and I'm going to use a bit of inspiration for him to take us on a very simple journey about the old world, i.e. what's going on in the world today, and then a revolution that is at hand in the world, which I am very excited about and think it holds great promise for us to be able to deal with all these great issues. And then I'm going to describe what this new world looks like. And through this, I'm going to apply it to healthcare, not just wider society. And here's the Curnow poem. It's called Landfall in Unknown Seas. And Curnow wrote it in December, or published it in December 1942, which was the 300th anniversary of when Abel Tasman caught sight of New Zealand. It all went horribly wrong, and some of his men had a very murderous encounter with Maori here because of great cultural misunderstandings. And so Tasman never actually landed. He just sailed on by, but he did give New Zealand its name. And Curnow's poem is quite marvellous because it starts musing about exploration and how we've done exploration forever. You know, you pick a captain, the person you think who can lead the team. You kind of assemble the people who can be spared, who you think are going to be useful. You choose a vessel that isn't needed for something else for the next year, and you kind of weigh up all the knowns and the unknowns, and they set off. And it was kind of simple. And the opening line of the poem is very simply this. Simply by sailing in a new direction, you could enlarge the world. So it was that sort of simplicity about how we discovered new places, new models. When it comes to health, I love data, and one of my favourite data is the OECD comparative health stats across the OECD. The 2015 version isn't out next week, so I'm using slightly old data. And one of my favourite questions is this. It's asking people, the population aged over 65 who are reporting to be in good health. And you can see New Zealanders, if you ask them that question, have the best response in the OECD. And you Australians, it's wonderful to have you over here. Welcome, you cuzzies from Aussie. You are almost as convinced of how healthy you are. There is one strange anomaly in this data, though. The Australian data makes sense in that the women think they are healthier than the men. But the very weird thing about the New Zealand data is the men think they're healthier than the women. I don't understand this unless the women filled in the form. We know we do healthcare very well and very efficiently in our two countries. So this is the amount of money that we spend in Australia and in New Zealand per capita, just kind of either side of the OECD average. And of course there are these bizarre outliers like the United States and the extraordinary amount of money they spend with no better health outcomes, and in some respects worse. I won't dwell on this data other than to pose this other mystery, which is about the strange case of psychiatrists. Now, this is psychiatrists per 100,000 population, and you can see the OECD average in the middle there. You Australians apparently need a little more help than the OECD average, so you're there. And you've been growing your number of psychiatrists over the last few years by about 1.9% a year. Here in New Zealand, we have slightly fewer psychiatrists, and the number's been decreasing. I don't know what this says about our two countries. I'm particularly puzzled when I consider this next fact, which is that both in Australia and New Zealand, we have more psychiatrists than the Americans, and the Americans have been reducing their number of psychiatrists. Now, this fundamentally, at many levels, makes no sense to me. And all I can think of is that our impression of psychiatrists and Americans focuses on some very small tribes in Manhattan, for which Woody Allen has a lot to be responsible for. However, this is a deeply unsustainable model, and we know about that. We know that we're not doing anywhere enough on prevention and wellness, and therefore we have far more ill health than we need. We do have primary care, but we rely an awful lot on what happens in hospitals, as you know, minute by minute in your lives and your work. And then post-hospital, yes, there's pretty good primary care and the like. And out there in the community. And it's a rough attempt to scale as to where the effort goes by size of a font there. But we know this is deeply, deeply unsustainable because of aging populations, the fast rise of long-term illnesses, many of them lifestyle-related, and fast rising healthcare costs. And so this is utterly unsustainable. Quite simply in economic terms, particularly as our economies slow and mature in Western developed economies like ours, socially in terms of the impact on societies of that. But I would argue that there is a big issue around environmentally as well, because I'm very mindful of the public health issues around degraded environments, degraded ecosystems, and what impact that has on people's health. So the whole way we are doing economy, we're doing society, we're doing our relationship with the environment, is all a pretty unhealthy mix about how we might do well-being better. So I'm going to now pick up on some of the big themes underpinning that and offer some views as to why this might be different. This chart is from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and it's their planetary boundaries. These are the biophysical boundaries which we can't argue with. So you'll see there familiar ones like climate change, and we know that that's a pretty big problem. But the very biggest is phosphorus and nitrogen flows. That is because of the way we farm, we introduce a lot of artificial energy in the form of phosphorus and nitrogen into the farming system through fertilizers to try to grow more food. And so we have seriously unbalanced those phosphorus and nitrogen flows. We see that, of course, daily here in New Zealand with the quality of our water and the degradation of our land. But the other very big one is the loss of biodiversity. Because of the weaknesses that then creates in the ecosystem and the decreasing ability for that ecosystem, our life support system, to support all life on the planet, not just us as humans. This is Beijing on a good day. I took that picture last month when I was in Beijing. This is Paris on a bad day. as a business journalist, it takes a lot to kind of rock me on my feet a bit. But on September the 17th this year, the news about how Volkswagen had deliberately set out to cheat on emission tests, particularly for the nitrous oxides, which are particularly poisonous in diesel engines. And they went on in the last 6 years to sell 11 million of those cars. Now, the estimates of the cost to them, this is not their estimate, it's external, is going to be at least 100 billion euros, round about 150 billion Australian or New Zealand dollars, to put that right. And so there is an ethical issue there as a start of that, let alone all the public health issues and the like that flow from it. On my trip, I went walkabout in September because there was a whole bunch of stuff I didn't understand in the world, was kind of disturbed about. So I divided the month between Beijing and London and Chicago. In Chicago, this is down on the south side. This was used to be a model industrial community, Pullman. And this is where George Pullman built luxury railroad cars, built towns to support those workers and all the rest. It all ended horribly. In the months before Pullman died, there was a horrendous strike, and the strike just finished about 10 days before he died, and his wife buried him under 10 tons of concrete and steel because she thought that the animosity was so great, his grave would be desecrated. Now, this has been abandoned land now for about 40 years, and local steel mills as well. But I went there to visit this factory, which is built on cradle-to-cradle principles. So in other words, everything we make, we can completely unmake. And so we have almost all the raw materials to make the next thing. So this is a very exciting project, making something quite humble, soaps, detergents, and the like. And growing food in that large greenhouse on the roof for people locally. Just a glimpse of how we might restore some of these balances. Most of the employees are local. The Pullman district is starting to revive through this and other initiatives. But what caught my eye on this abandoned building was this slogan: what is your vision of a contemporary utopian community? The World Economic Forum, the people in Switzerland who bring together the world's economic and political elite every year at Davos, know about all this. Every year they do a risk assessment, and this is this year's. And across the bottom is the likelihood of something happening. Think of Kate's volcanoes. And the vertical axis is the damage escalating that any of those would cause. I'll focus on the top right-hand corner, the most likely with the biggest impact. So it's things we know about: water crises, failure of climate change adaptation, fiscal crisis, unemployment or underemployment, cyber attacks, asset bubbles, profound social instability, and food crises. But a lot of what happens at Davos is this. They sit around talking. And as you can see in this picture, they're not even listening to each other. One person is staring very intently at his glass of water, probably wondering how pure it is. Meanwhile, this is what's happening outside. And here's another photo you might have seen in recent weeks. This man is the head of human relations. What a horrible word, human relations, because obviously the relations are often rather bad. From Air France, who's just come out of a meeting with employees. Now, he can afford a new shirt, but that only patches up his status, his sense of importance. It doesn't fix the system. And that's in a developed country. This is what's happening with Syria. Climate change is one of the aspects about Syria. Of course, it's all about the political system there. But this is what we would see a lot more of. Here in New Zealand, two of our most beautiful indigenous animals. On the left, fairy terns. There are only 14 breeding pairs left in New Zealand. On the right, Maui dolphins. There's only 55 of them. And yet, our government is intent on encouraging overseas oil companies to come here with one of the most beneficial royalty regimes in Asia, i.e. least money to the country involved, to explore in very difficult deep offshore waters for the oil the world doesn't need. Because we know that if we need to keep climate change to within 2 degrees, we know we can only have a trillion tons of human-induced carbon in the atmosphere, and we've got about 400 billion tons left to put up there. We know the budget, and therefore all the oil, gas and coal already on the balance sheets of fossil fuel companies is already 3 to 4 times that. We've got more fossil fuels, even oil, than we can possibly burn, and yet we explore for more. So, as we increase these pressures on the ecosystem, we keep snipping at all those strands in the web of life and degrade the ability of the ecosystem to support us. In the past, there have been 5 great extinctions of species in the world in the last 500 million years. All first 5 were created by things like great volcanic explosions or asteroids hitting the planet. This 6th great one is in the Anthropocene. This is the first geological era where humankind has such a huge impact on the ecosystem that we are changing it. And that's why this geological era is named after us. We've got some work to do. What does the revolution look like? This is one of my favorite photos. As you'll see, it's upside down, you think. But to the people who took this picture, it was the right way up. This was taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts as they lift Earth's gravity on the way to the moon. And they took this picture on December the 7th, 1973. And of course, in space where there's no gravity, it doesn't matter kind of how you hang, it's all very comfortable. So they were seeing the world upside down, which of course is great, because that puts Australia and New Zealand where we deserve to be, on top of the world. But to me, it's a very simple metaphor for paradox. It's about turning things on their head to see what we might make of them, how we might respond to them. So here are 3 words to help us save ourselves. We're not trying to save the planet. The planet survives great extinctions. Some other life forms will evolve. It's not about saving the planet, it's about saving us. So the 3 words, curiously, all have origins in ancient Greek. So the word ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home. The word economy comes from economia, which is about stewardship of a household. And you had 3 obligations: to your family, to the wider people you are responsible for, such as servants, and to your community. You were expected to be, as a citizen, a very big contributor to your community. The 3rd word is ethics, from the Greek ethos, about the nature or disposition or something. So if we get the right ethics into our economy, we can then start to do the right things by the ecosystem. So the very biggest shift to make is to restore that relationship with each other and our relationship between us and the planet by working with nature, not against it. And that factory on the south side of Chicago is just a tiny, tiny example of how you start working with nature, not against it. One of my favorite areas of technology is when we borrow from biology, from nature. And so I'll just highlight at the top, in the center there, that's an office complex in Zimbabwe, in Harare, the capital. Now, Harare is quite high up, so it's hot during the day and cold during the night. This is a modern office complex which has neither mechanical heating, ventilation, or cooling, because the airflows through the building are modeled on what happens in an ant heap. So this gives you a glimpse of how we can learn profoundly from nature about how we can do things very, very differently. You've heard of green buildings. These are living buildings. These are buildings that are self-sufficient for power and water. The first designated green building is this one in Seattle, opened a couple of years ago. And our first here in New Zealand is this utterly gorgeous building of Tuhoes in the Uruweras. A building self-sufficient for energy and water. And of course, quite right, we each do this in our own way. We each find our own expression of this. So an American living building looks like the Bullitt Centre. A New Zealand living building looks like this, true to our cultural roots. And in your own way in Australia, you'd find your own way of doing living buildings. We're also starting to understand the economics of this a lot better. And a new group was created by 7 countries 5 years ago called the Global Commission on the Economy and the Climate to help us understand how we might do this differently. They have produced some incredibly readable reports which have quite changed mindsets ahead of the Paris climate negotiations starting in 5 weeks' time. And they're very readable. You don't need to be an economist or anything. Just reading about downloading their Better Growth Climate shows, for example, how we can already build better low-carbon cities more cheaply and run them more efficiently than the way we're building cities already. A lot of the technology we already need is there. It's about choice. It's about political will. It's about commitment to want to do these things. Crucially, whilst the government level is important and the overarching global framework, where we see the biggest changes is actually in cities. So this is cities committed through the Carbon Disclosure Project to setting targets. First of all, identifying what their carbon footprint is, 308, setting targets, 109, and taking action, 96. And there's already been some very substantial movement in cities, both in the developing and developed world, around this. And that makes sense to me, that it is where you can get a better sense of community, a stronger sense of community, even in a big city, that you would start to move on these issues. Then there is also the very intense pressure on economics and business. And there are many elements to this, but by far the most coherent view that's come through recently is this book, published a couple of months ago in London by Paul Mason. Mason is economics editor of Channel 4 TV in the UK, incredibly articulate for a television journalist. Sorry, television has its place. But this is an absolutely fascinating book about how technology and social and all sorts of other enormous shifts in the world are profoundly reshaping societies and economies. And then bringing it all together, this is Kate Raworth. Kate is a British economist, but as you see here from the main slagline on her website, it's time to vandalize the economic textbooks. Kate worked for many years for the United Nations Development Programme as co-editor of their annual Human Development Report. She then went to work for Oxfam, and it was doodling in a workshop one day that she came up with this wonderful sense of how the world should work. And she called it the Doughnut Economy. So the center ring there is the social foundation. This is about strong communities, about empowered people. So it's about water, income, education, resilience, voice, jobs, energy, social equity, gender equity, health, food, and water. Because it's only when people have those can they and their communities function strongly and change and respond. The outer circle is those planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which I was talking about earlier in that scary black chart. So between that social floor and that environmental ceiling is the safe and just space for humanity where inclusive and sustainable economic development could happen. Now, a very interesting thing happened at the United Nations just a few weeks ago. They considered the Millennium Development Goals done to the best of their ability. Actually, they achieved a very great deal, but their time frame was up. But that was all about developing countries. What happened in New York at the United Nations a few weeks ago was the unveiling of the Sustainable Development Goals, because so many of these issues are very major issues in developed countries too, like ours in New Zealand and yours in Australia. So the Sustainable Development Goals does not distinguish between developed countries and developing countries, but recognizes that these are issues that all countries are dealing with. And I think that's a huge step forward in terms of that thinking about this. So what about the new world? Let me bring this right back to health. I won't wander far and wide across the social landscape. So here it is about health. One of the important things in my journey on this was a report back 10 years ago from the European Union about the contribution of health to the European Union. And to me, it was a complete paradox about the importance of health. So up to that point, I'd been thinking about health largely as a byproduct of a successful economy. In other words, the more successful economy was, the more it grew, the richer it was, the more the tax, the better the medical technology, the better healthcare I got. But this starts to turn things around. It's saying that health is actually an investment in people and their community. It's not a cost, it's an investment. And so it measures the upside of life. So this is the wonderful spurious precision that economists love. That a 10% increase in life expectancy in birth generates a 0.3 to 0.4% increase in GDP per year. Variations in health levels explain between 10 and 20% of the difference in incomes between EU countries. And improving health accounted for 11% of Europe's economic activity over a 25-year period. Now, here's the really bold claim by economists. Improved health accounted for 30% of per capita income growth in the UK from 1780 to 1980. How's that for precision? They are probably wrong in detail, but certainly right in trend. So what I'd argue for is we need a big shift in health perspective. So in the past, we thought that the drive to improve health was largely an issue for economies of developing countries, because we'd kind of reached the pinnacle in developed countries of health. So for us, we had it made. We saw health as a byproduct of economic development. The wealthier we got, the longer we lived. But here's the really big switch, where we need to turn this on our head. Health is a driver of economic and social development too, and essential because of those demographic and health cost pressures that we're all so familiar with. So that's the paradox. Health is an investment, not a cost. That's a very, very hard message to sell to policymakers and treasuries, and it requires a very big switch in how we measure things and manage them, and how we understand how we invest in better health outcomes and greater wellness, so we take our pressure off you all in intensive care when things go very wrong. And this happens in community, because you look across the world and all of these are intensely global issues, but they can only be solved locally. By getting it right in a small town, in a neighborhood, in a larger town, across a part of a country, a province, a state, or the whole country, and then aggregating that up across the world, whether it is something like healthcare or climate change or biodiversity loss, you name it. These are universal issues, but they can only be solved locally, of course, within helpful global frameworks. So these solutions require very strong learning communities. And I don't mean just the population locally, but communities of health specialists, for example. So the relationships you have, the right relationships that enable you to develop what you do and become more effective. And for me, these strong learning communities have three key attributes. They have common sense, a common understanding of what needs to be done. They have a common purpose about what they're going to do, and they generate common wealth, not just in an economic sense, but a social, cultural, and environmental one as well. Communities like that value individuals and help them make the most of their potential. It encourages them to participate, so they too can bring their ingenuity, their energy to these great tasks at hand. Now, in healthcare, we know we're good in community. This is a long-running study of 11 countries by the Commonwealth Fund of New York City, which focuses mostly on primary care and the patient-doctor relationship. And I won't dwell on the detail here, but you can see Australia on the left, New Zealand in the middle. And the ones to focus on in those bars are where there's dark blue, which puts that country in the top 2 out of the 11. So it's various measures of the quality care and access and efficiency, equity, healthy lives, and then, of course, the crucial one of expenditure. So down at the bottom, as I said earlier, Australia and New Zealand are extremely good on efficient healthcare in terms of the money we spend per person. But, for example, Australia scores a 2 on the quality of care overall, and New Zealand is 2 on effective care and on coordinated care. We've got some big problems around equity. As you see, we're a 10 there. Sweden's good, Switzerland's good, the UK is very good in this respect. Although I'm very fascinated to see how the big change in relationships between GPs and how they then negotiate services with hospitals and elsewhere is going to work out in following years, but that's a big issue for later. But for me, there's a sense there that we already have a lot of these relationships that we can develop. My great plea, though, would be to think completely out of the box. So IDEO, the Great California Design House, is one of my favorite organizations in the world in terms of how it reconceives opportunities and challenges, and they do a lot of work in healthcare, particularly around sort of the health experience. So just one example, but a plea for involving everybody in a process, a very creative process that helps us map out some new relationships and new ways to do this. So then we have a strong community and far greater well-being. And so we start to reduce that ill health. We still need that deeply integrated care, but working in conjunction with a lot more self-care. Hospitals are still going to be hugely important. You won't be out of a job. And then coming back after hospital into very strong community care. So to me, that seems like a very sustainable model of healthcare. One that responds to these intense pressures on you, but helps you, I hope, draw some inspiration for these profound shifts going on in the world. What's going on in the world is an utterly unprecedented scale of change and speed of change and complexity of change that humankind has never come within cooey of before. So that's how good we have to be at change across all the things we do, not just healthcare. And so, not quite the last lines of Curno's poem, but what he's saying here is that exploration is now vastly different than it was in Tasman's day. But now there are no more islands to be found, and the eye scans risky horizons of its own in unsettled weather, and murmurs of the drowned haunt our familiar beaches. Who navigates us towards what? Unknown, but not improbable provinces. Who reaches a future down for us from the high shelf of spiritual daring? Thank you.